So, time for one more horror movie for the Halloween season. Today I'm going to be taking a look at 2019's *Midsummer*. This movie is directed by Ari Aster, and you can see that this director has a definite style similar to Hereditary. This director likes to go the disturbing route. This movie is another slow burn, slow build, but an interesting story along the way, and it is filled with disturbing imagery along the way. So let's take a look at 2019's *Midsummer*. So the movie starts out with Danny. She's trying to call her parents to check on them and also to see if they've heard from her sister, who she received a disturbing email from, and she's now unable to reach. She also tries to reach out to her boyfriend and asks him to come over, and he says he will, although he's currently out with his friends. We find out that he was thinking about leaving Danny because he finds her too emotionally needy, and it turns out that she was worried about that as well. However, he doesn't get to follow through with this plan or continue down that path because on this night, Danny is stricken with grief because it turns out her sister's email was true and she had, in fact, committed suicide and killed her parents in the process. She hooked both tubing up to both of their cars in their garage and let them run and let the exhaust run through the house, through the tubing up into the parents' bedroom, and then through a tube that she had attached to her own face, killing herself and her parents in one move. So Danny is immediately at the beginning of the movie stricken with grief, and we see that the boyfriend Christian is staying with her to comfort her through her time of need. They go to a party, and she's disturbed at the party to find out that Christian is planning to go to Sweden with his group of friends and hasn't told her about this. They get to a fight about it, and ultimately, Christian, in order to move past it, invites Danny to go with them to Sweden, which she ultimately accepts. Most of Christian's friends are okay with Danny tagging along, with the exception of Mark, who thinks that Christian should break up with Danny. We also should note that Pele is one of the friends here, and he notes that they are going to be going to his hometown, and so right there is a signal that he's involved with whatever is going on in this movie. They do board their flight and get to Sweden. Danny's, of course, having some emotional distress along the way. They get to Sweden and immediately start heading north to his town, which is a 4-hour drive. It's clearly in a very remote area. They first park in an open field where he says the young people are gathering, and we see a group of young people gather throughout the field. Pele meets up with his brother, who also brought some guests with him, two people from England. They all introduce, and then they decide they're all going to take some mushrooms together. Danny's reluctant at first, but not wanting to be a party pooper, eventually agrees, and she takes it in the form of tea. They're all starting to hallucinate and have some weird images and act odd. Danny's getting upset and begins walking around the field. She goes into the bathroom where she sees an image of her sister in the background, and then she runs out, and then they find her later. She had fallen asleep in the field, and they say it's the next day, which is Danny's birthday, and they are going to be heading the rest of the way on their journey at this point. Now, it is worth noting here that the reason they're coming to Pele's hometown is to observe the town's summer festival, and this is because Josh, one of the group, is studying these type of festivals for his dissertation. And it's worth noting that Christian is also looking for a subject for his dissertation, but hasn't picked one yet. As they arrive in the village, it's very clearly an odd place right off the bat. It's a small, quaint little village. Everybody's in simple attire, white gowns mostly. And some of the people are playing instruments, some of the people are singing, some of the people are running around. Right off the bat, everything seems a little too serene, and it seems a little ritualistic right off the way because they're going about it in a very specific manner. And as they're observing and being shown around, they then are introduced to the elder of the group, and then they're taken over to see a presentation being made. Now, the woman speaking is speaking in Swedish mostly, so they don't understand most of it, although she does translate parts into English. She mentions that they're going to be having a feast that they haven't had for 90 years and won't have for 90 years again. That's a little off-putting right away. I'd have been a little nervous hearing that as a newcomer into this village. The woman giving the speech makes an interesting remark, saying spirits back to the dead, an odd thing. As they're looking around, you see a lot of odd things. They have a bear in a cage, a building that they say they're not allowed to go into, painted like a yellow kind of pyramid style building in the back. And there's some depictions of art that are pretty odd and odd to describe. Pele takes them to the barn where they sleep. It's a sleeping quarters. It's an open barn type space surrounded with beds. It also has some weird imagery on the wall. And if they had paid attention to this, they might have avoided some trouble because the images on the wall basically depict what's going to be happening throughout the movie. And Pele gives them a description of the life cycle of their people, saying that they're separated into four groups like the season. There's the young, 0 to 18, who share this younger sleeping space. Then there's 18 to 36 when they're a little bit older is the summer. The 0 to 18 had been the spring. 36 to 54 for them is the fall and the working group where they're doing the bulk of their work. And 54 to 72 is the winter of their life cycle, and that's when they become advisors. And it is noted they ask Pele what happens after 72, and he makes a throat cutting gesture. This turns out to be more true than they would realize. And as they're preparing for bed, he tells them that there's going to be the first big ceremony tomorrow, and that is the case. They all go to sleep, and the next day they are out and they're observing the ceremony around the village. They're observing everything. They get to a point where they are all gathered at an odd table, and it seems, again, very ritualistic as the two older people come up to the table. Two people who had been in the ceremony the day before. The group is following their lead and don't eat till they begin. And then at the end, the old people stand up and do some chanting, and then they take a drink of a liquid, and everybody else takes a drink to follow, and then they are put into some chairs that they are being carried away, and the group all begins to walk. We get to a cliff face where everybody's gathered at the bottom. Notably, one man is holding a hammer, and they see the older two people arrive at the top. There's a ritual going on up at the top. Their hands are cut and they're shown. And one by one, as everybody watches below, the older two people walk up to the ledge and jump off one by one, killing themselves. The woman falls to her death, killing herself right away. The man falls feet first and breaks his legs but doesn't die. So that's what the big hammer was for. They came over and four people, one by one, hit him with the hammer to ensure that he was dead. And the leader, the woman who was kind of reading from a book, kind of indicates that this is part of their life cycle. Their life cycle, they believe that when they reach this age, they give their life back. They die, it's part of their culture, it's something that they do, it's a tradition, and their name is passed on to a newborn baby so that they are renewed and continue. Two of the guests who had come are both immediately very upset. These are Connie and Simon. They came with Pele's brother, and they are shocked, yelling at everybody, and they just want to leave. The other parts of the group just seem to be in shock. As they're walking back, Danny notes that she just needs some time to go alone, and Christian goes to Josh in the barn and he tells them that he's going to be writing a dissertation on these people in this village. This, of course, is a big shock to Josh because that's what he's here to do, and so he feels like Christian is basically stealing his idea rather than coming up with his own, which he is. And it turned out that they had both attempted to talk to Pele about this to get permission from the elders. And Pele does eventually give them permission, but notes that they have to share it and that they can't take any pictures, they can't use real names, and they can't even hint at the true location of this town. After you see the events of this movie, you'll see why they're willing to give this permission because it doesn't really matter. Danny wants to leave, but is ultimately calmed down by Pele and stays. And Simon and Connie also say they're going to be leaving the next day because they're still in shock. The bodies of the two older people who jumped from the cliff are being cremated over a fire. Danny asks Josh for a sleeping pill to be able to sleep that night, and he gives it to her. And she has a nightmare in which she thinks that they are attempting to leave without her. The next day they come out and the ashes of the older people are taken and they're being spread out beneath a tree that has fallen down. And at this point is when Pele actually gave them permission to write their papers, and they both, Josh and Christian, go about starting to do research and try to gather information for that purpose. Now, Mark makes a stupid mistake and goes over and starts peeing on the fallen tree that they were shoveling the ashes under, and a man starts freaking out and yelling at him, and it's because this is a sacred tree where they put the bodies of all of their dead. So he's just created a big problem by insulting them all in a major way. It's also worth noting at that night before, while sleeping, Pele's younger sister had taken a rune, which it turns out to be a love rune, and had put it under Christian's bed to try to put a love spell on him. So, this is the part where things start to go bad for the people who have come as guests to this village, and the town seems to make it seem effortless to separate these people from each other and to do what they need to do. First, we know that Connie and Simon both want to leave, and as Connie goes and says goodbye to someone, she comes out with her bags, and the elder approaches her and says that Simon has already left in the truck to the train station, and he said the truck will come back and take her next. He's got a whole slew of excuses saying that he just had to go, there wasn't a lot of time, and that it there wasn't enough room in the truck for both of them, so they could only take them one at a time. It's some light excuses, but Connie eventually lets it go and goes about her business. Very upset though. And then Danny's invited into the kitchen to help cook, and everybody else is again going about. Mark's just kind of wandering while Josh and Christian are both doing research. Christian is asking the people some questions. Josh is actually looking at the sacred book. He wants to take pictures, but they won't let him. And they tell him that the book is written by oracles. We see a girl who's kind of disfigured, and they say this is their oracle. He says that their oracle is specifically someone who is inbred and picked for that purpose. They draw pictures and things like that, and the elders interpret it, and that's how they write their sacred texts. They next sit down for another meal, and they're being given meat pies. Actually, it's worth noting in the previous scene that we did hear Connie screaming in the distance, so we assume she was killed at this point. And I kind of assumed that it was potentially Simon that was being made into the meat pies, although I'm not sure if that's true. Although when they are eating, Christian takes a bite of a meat pie, and there is a hair of a very undesirable variety in his meat pie, and this was depicted in some of the art as a part of the love spell. So we can pretty much determine that this was Maya who had put this into his pie. Another girl approaches Mark and asks him to follow her and says she'll show him, and that's enough for him. He follows her off, and this is the last time we see Mark alive. He's done for. That night, they're back in the room and they're all getting ready for bed, and Danny asks for another sleeping pill. Josh notably goes to bed with his shoes on because he is too eager to get more information. He sneaks out of the room at night and goes over to the chapel building, and in there he is looking at the sacred text and taking pictures when someone comes in wearing Mark's skin as a suit. Very disturbing, but it fools Josh for a moment as he turns around, and then someone hits him over the head with a hammer, killing him. So both Josh and Mark are now dead, as well as Simon and Connie. The next day, Danny seems to be the only one who seems to be noticing that everybody else is missing. Christian basically says he's not too concerned about it. After their meal, the elders announce that the sacred text has been taken and they'd like it to be returned. And they basically state that there's nobody's going to be watching the building, nobody's going to be guarding it, and somebody can just return the book and nobody will know. They approach Christian and Danny, and Christian immediately apologizes and says if Josh took it, he's not associated with that in any way and doesn't want to be, and he apologizes. And they don't know what happened to the others in the group. He said he knows Mark wouldn't do that, even though they don't know where he is. The elders now take the opportunity to separate Christian and Danny, sending Danny with the women for the day's activity and sending Christian to speak to one of the elder women. Danny is going off and she's giving another hallucinogenic drink. And what they're going to be doing is dancing, having basically a dance competition to dance around until there's only one left standing, who will be named the May Queen. Christian is speaking to the woman, and she's basically just telling him outright that they have selected him and they want him to mate with Maya to produce an offspring because they are compatible. They had noted earlier that they sometimes need to keep the gene pools clean. They don't like to do inbreeding except for the oracles, so they sometimes have to bring in outsiders for this purpose. He doesn't quite know how to take this, but he goes out and begins watching the dancing, and someone brings him a drink telling him it's also a hallucinogenic drink to loosen him up. He drinks that reluctantly. He almost doesn't, it'd been better if he hadn't for him. Eventually, Danny's the last one standing, and she wins the dance competition and is named the May Queen. Immediately, she's put on a platform, carried over to a table, and they begin eating. And they follow her lead this time as they did the older people in the beginning. Christian's sitting at the table, but he's very drugged out at this point. He's asking someone what's going on, and they just kind of clap, and it sends him into a spiral. He is very susceptible at this point from whatever they gave him. They try to get Danny to eat a whole herring, and she does not, is able to. And then they take her off for a carriage ride to do another ceremony as the May Queen. They bury some seeds, some meat, some eggs in a hole and start reciting some passages over it. While this is going on, Christian is taken by the others to the chapel building where he is prepared for this mating ritual. He's not really able to resist at this point. They give him something to breathe in that they say is for vitality, and he's led into a room where Maya is laying on the floor, and there are several naked women of varying ages in a semicircle around her, and he is led forward, and there's some unnecessary imagery here, but basically he does begin sleeping with Maya as the other women around chant and repeat the noises, which is a little bit unnecessary. Danny gets back and they try to prevent her too, although I don't really think they try to stop her too hard. As she walks in and sees Christian doing this, she's immediately grief stricken. When Christian and Maya finish, he immediately runs out of the building and he's looking for shelter. He's without clothes and he's running around place to place and eventually makes it into a chicken coop where he finds Simon's body hung up. So we finally see what happened to him. And then someone blows some powder in his face and he is paralyzed and unconscious. He's waken up, he's still paralyzed, he can't move or say anything, but this is where the final plot of the movie is revealed. Basically, as part of their 90-year ceremony, and this ceremony that they've taken to, there's going to be a final sacrifice, and it is a total of 9 people. 4 local people from the village and 4 outsiders. Now, they've already got the 4 outsiders. They've got Josh, Mark, Connie, and Simon. And they've got 2 locals. The 2 older people who killed themselves already are 2 of them. They have a volunteer. They have 2 volunteers, people who had brought in people from the outside. And there is a final person who is going to be picked by the May Queen. Now, that person is either going to be Christian or a person picked by a lottery style drawing from the village. Now, Danny is sitting in a dress made completely of flowers at this point, and it's her decision. And she picks Christian, we quickly find out, as they're wheeling bodies that they have decorated in weird ways into the yellow pyramid style building in the back that we saw earlier. And Christian is prepared by being sewn into the body of the dead bear. We see the elders teaching the younger ones how to prepare the bear's body by removing insides, and then they sew Christian into it and put him in the barn as well. The 2 volunteers are given something that they say is to make sure they feel no pain and fear as they're about to set this building on fire with these nine sacrifices inside. They do so, and the building burns down, and the people outside are all reacting in different ways, chanting, screaming, reacting as though they're in pain from the flames. Danny is at first going around kind of just staring, then she's like retching, kind of upset, and finally she just stares and smiles. And I assume with this ending that Danny is now part of this community and is going to stay as their May Queen. So, thoughts on this movie? As I said, Ari Aster definitely seems to like the disturbing imagery. There is a lot of that in this movie. It's definitely psychological along the way, as we see Danny is grief stricken from the very beginning of the movie, so she's not in a very healthy headspace for any of this. It's odd to see how this movie develops, as you would think from the moment that the old people jumped off the cliff, that would be it. You would think that the entire group of outsiders would all at once be ready to leave and bail out and get out as quick as they could all together. And that's what they should have done in this case, instead of allowing themselves to slowly be separated and picked off one by one. And none of them even really seemed concerned. Josh and Christian were both thrilled at the thought that they could write their dissertations on this topic. You would think, even if you're interested in this type of ritual and this type of culture and this type of thing, you would still be shocked at this type of action and you wouldn't want to stay and observe it in the first person. And you should know that if they're willing to do this, that they are willing to do something to outsiders coming in, and you should think that there's a reason you're there and not that they're just welcoming you to be a part of things. However, the town does have their ways of doing things, is that they're offering them hallucinogenic substances and drinks along the way, so they're kind of controlling things and controlling the mindset of people even throughout the entire thing. Pele's a big example of this. They're here because of Pele. He brought them in to bring outsiders in for the purpose of this. And he's very interested in the fact that Danny was coming from the very beginning when they found out. Originally, it was just going to be him and his couple of friends, and Danny wasn't going to come. And it's very interesting that it seems as though Pele was trying to slowly begin the process of turning Danny on Christian. He's flirting with her at various points, and that's very clear. And the village managed to turn Danny against Christian altogether, as at the end, after seeing that he was cheating on her, she decided to have him sacrificed in the final scene. Now, unbeknownst to her, that this wasn't of his own will, and he was drugged and coerced into sleeping with Maya, but it was all part of this village's plan. It's obvious they've been doing this for a long time. This isn't their first go around. This was just a new group of people, and they were doing whatever they needed to do to get done what they want to get done for their ritualistic lifestyle. Now, as I said at the beginning, this movie is a definite slow burn and a slow build, and you really have to wait for it to get to things. Although when things pick up, they do pick up rather rapidly, and we see what's going on. It's very clear that something's going on from the very beginning of the movie, but it does take its time to get there. This movie is what you would call a good psychological thriller. It's not like a pure horror. It's not purely scary or really scary at all. It's just this kind of a thriller that's going to keep you on a ride up and down. And again, it's a slow build, but it's worth it when it gets there. I thought this movie delivered pretty well. I especially like Florence Pugh. I feel like she delivers a very good performance in this movie, from the grief she's experiencing throughout it to being manipulated slowly, and then ultimately it seems like she's going to become part of this society by the end of the movie. So if you're all about the action and getting to the point right away, this movie isn't for you. But if you don't mind waiting, enjoying things, and watching them unfold slowly, little by little, then you'll probably enjoy this movie. Again, as a psychological thriller, it's a pretty good one. Critics seem to really enjoy this movie. It got on Rotten Tomatoes an 83% fresh score from critics. Audiences a little bit less, 63% fresh, but still a fresh score. And I think, again, for me, that's because this movie isn't going to be everybody's cup of tea because it is such a slow burn. Over on IMDb, the movie gets a 7.1 out of 10, and that's about where I fall as well. I get a little bit higher. I would actually give this movie a 7.5 out of 10 because I did enjoy it. I don't mind watching a movie, taking its time, and getting that slow burn, especially if it has a good payoff at the end, which I feel like this movie did. A lot don't, but this movie did deliver, so it was worth the wait. Let me know your thoughts on Midsummer in the comments section. Please be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and keep an eye out for my next video coming soon.